It was late August 1996. At 19, I returned home after a night of partying to a house that was unnervingly quiet. I found my mom sitting alone at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in front of her. The sight of her, so still and silent, immediately filled me with a sense of dread. My mom never drank in the daytime, and her stillness was a clear signal that something was terribly wrong. When I sat down, she looked at me and delivered the words that shattered my world. "Your dad is gone. He's not coming back." My heart sank. "Do you mean he's dead?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She shook her head. "No, he just left." A fleeting wave of relief washed over me, only to be replaced by the crushing weight of shock. A torrent of questions came next. Where did he go? Why? How do you know? Her answers were nothing but helpless shrugs. There was no warning, no note. He had simply packed a suitcase and driven off into the unknown. The conversation ended with my mom in tears, and me holding her, unable to make the promise that everything would be okay. For months, his disappearance was an unspoken void in our lives. The pain and confusion were too raw to touch. Every time I tried to ask my mom about it, she would either break down in tears or lash out in anger, screaming, "That piece of crap is dead to me." Her silence and the suspicion that she was hiding something fueled a burning curiosity in me. I knew I had to find the truth myself. My search began with Carl, my dad's only close friend. I figured if anyone knew something, it would be him. But Carl was just as surprised as we were. However, he did offer a few potential locations my dad might have gone. After ruling out the closer ones, one name stood out: Wrigley, a remote town in northern Canada. Carl told me my dad had spent a summer there in college and always talked about going back. It was a 30-hour drive through the wilderness to a town with a population of only 100 people. But that isolation was my greatest hope. If my dad wanted to disappear, this was the perfect place to do it, and also the perfect place for him to be found. The second picture showed a younger version of my dad with a woman, both in hiking gear, standing next to a large rock. Winston recognized it immediately as Hunter's Rock, a landmark about 10 miles outside of town. He told me the local legend. It was the spear of a mythical hunter, a story that was neither confirmed nor disproven by geologists who studied it in the 80s. They simply couldn't explain how it could possibly extend a mile deep into the earth. The mystery of the rock only deepened my curiosity about why my dad, with no interest in geology, would have been there. But then Winston's gaze locked on the woman in the photograph. He asked if I knew who she was. When I said no, he excused himself to make a phone call. He returned with a stunned expression, telling me with 80% certainty that the woman was a girl who had gone missing in the early 70s near Great Bear Lake. Her face was eerily similar to the missing person posters he had seen as a kid. He advised me to go to the local government office to be sure. The next morning, I went to the office inside the town's medical clinic and met Chief Irwin, the leader of the Bzaki First Nation. He was initially welcoming, offering to show me around the tribal lands. But when I told him I was looking for my dad and showed him the old photograph, his face went from warm to ice cold. He looked at me and said, "I think you and me should step into my office." I was thrilled, not scared. I had finally found a lead. Chief Irwin revealed that the girl in the picture was named Susan Culver, a college student who had vanished in the summer of 1973. He then pointed to my dad and dropped the bombshell. My father was one of the suspects arrested and questioned by the RCMP in connection with her disappearance. This news was shocking, but it was also the first real progress I had made in 18 months. Everything suddenly clicked. I began to believe that my dad's disappearance was a desperate attempt to deal with a past he could no longer outrun. He must have returned to Wrigley to finally find answers about the girl he loved and lost. and it finally explained my mom's grief and anger. She must have known something about Susan, and it was the secret she had been hiding all along. Chief Irwin continued, telling me that Susan Culver's remains had never been found, so no one had ever been charged in connection with her disappearance. He also mentioned that her last known location was in the jaws of Great Bear Lake, in what were known among the tribes as the Siouxlands. That was where the Mounties had found her campsite, totally abandoned, but also totally undisturbed. He took a good look at the more recent picture of my dad before telling me that he hadn't seen him. But the chief was also quick to add that if my dad was heading straight toward Hunter's Rock, there was no real reason for him to stop back in town, especially if it was a place that held the bad memories of being arrested. If he wanted to really look for the missing girl, or even if he just wanted to pay his respects to the place where she was last seen alive, it made sense that he went straight up to the Great Bear Lake, at least if he was up there in Canada and not someplace else entirely. The only issue was getting there. From Wrigley, it was about a 200-mile drive to get to a place called DeLune, and if you didn't have a decent 4x4, which I obviously didn't, then there was no point in trying to make the drive. But even if I did have one, I was still looking at a 30-mile hike out into the marshlands through all kinds of muck and mosquitoes. Yes, they still have them up there. It was to the exact spot where Susan Culver's campsite was found. I could go through the process of hiring a 4x4, driving up to DeLune, and then hiking for 3 days through some pretty hellish terrain, and it could end up being for nothing. I considered it a very noble pursuit. There was literally nothing more important to me than trying to find my dad and potentially bring him home. But like any great effort, the spirit was willing, yet the flesh was weak, and in my case, my bank account was even weaker. I simply couldn't afford to extend my stay by another few days, as I'd already taken a whole week off of work and had spent a ton of money on gas, motel rooms, and road food. It was either throw in the towel or call my mom and beg her to transfer some money into my account. I'd then have to call work and risk getting fired after begging for a few extra days off when I had already put my manager in a pretty bad bind by requesting a week off at relatively short notice. Calling it quits and then maybe heading back at a later date seemed like the logical course of action, but being up there in the Northwestern Territories made me feel like I was so close. I could practically feel him up there with me somehow. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was no turning back. Not unless I wanted to live with the regret of inaction for the rest of my life. But the thing that really sealed it was when Chief Irwin told me that DeLune had an RCMP office. And that was the place they had questioned my dad after his friend Susan disappeared. They'd have records, written reports, everything I needed to get more information about what had happened to her and my dad. With that in mind, I called work, and then I called my mom. Getting the time off was easy because I was just honest with my manager and told him what I was doing. My dad had left. We were worried about him. So I was off looking for him in the hopes of bringing him home and maybe even saving his lifelog too. At that, my manager said, "Take all the time you need." And my mom, on the other hand, was not so easy to convince. She didn't know where I was or what I was doing, so when I called her and informed her of the situation, she was not happy at first. In light of what I was doing, she refused to wire me any money and told me to return home immediately. I had to argue with her for about a half hour straight, using the phone in the Wrigley gas station's office, before she finally relented and agreed to send me some money. I'd be lying if I said that it didn't get a little tearful at points, and I'll be forever grateful to old Winston for giving me my privacy during that phone call. It was quite possibly one of the most intense I've ever had. I also owe Winston in another, even bigger way. It was he who agreed to drive me all the way up to DeLune near Great Bear Lake in exchange for nothing but gas money. I guess he was pretty invested in my little story by that point, especially once I shared what I'd learned from Chief Irwin. But before we set off the next day, he told me that he wouldn't be following me out into the marshes, I told him that I wasn't expecting him to, and how I wasn't 100% decided on whether or not I was headed that far anyway. But then he said something that sticks with me to this day. He asked, "If your dad's out looking for the girl, and you're out looking for him, who's going to end up looking for you? Ever think about that?" And I remember those words. I hadn't. I'd never even paid one single iota of thought towards that concept. But when I did, in the moments after Winston asked me, it chilled me to the bone. On the drive up to Deline the next day, Winston managed to completely talk me out of walking the 30-plus miles into the marshes. If my dad was out there and hadn't lost his mind, he'd at least have some basic camping gear. Me? I didn't even have a tent, let alone enough camp food or the right boots to make it through 30 miles of marshy wilderness and back. So realistically, there was no way I could go after my dad in the Sao lands. But what I could do was check in with the RCMP up in Deline, let them know about my dad's situation, and leave my contact details in case there were any sightings. And maybe, just maybe, someone up there could tell me more about why my dad was arrested in connection with his friend's disappearance. It took us about 5 hours to get up to Deline. When we arrived, Winston drove us straight to the RCMP office, which, thankfully, was right next to a grocery store. He said he'd pick up some sodas and hot food, and I headed into the office alone. The place was just a small reception area with a bigger room behind it. After glancing through the open doorway, I traded greetings with a young, red-coated Mountie. Constable Jacobs, who was about my age, seemed eager to help. But when he realized I had more than just a basic inquiry, he told me to sit tight while he radioed the only other Mountie in Deline, a man named Mackenzie. Not his real name, and for good reason, as I'd soon learn. Mackenzie, much older than his junior co-worker, seemed far better equipped for historical questions, and he did help. He was a little frosty at first, but after I told him my whole story, he warmed up. Mackenzie actually remembered the incident involving Susan Culver and my dad. He'd been a junior constable back in the 70s. During the investigation, he remembered my dad stumbling back into Deline alone. He recalled it was my dad who'd reported Susan missing, and how, after the initial round of questioning, the Mounties basically had no choice but to consider my dad a suspect. Mackenzie hadn't been present for either interview, so all he knew was that my dad had somehow implicated himself. And that was it. They had all the files and reports on site, but Mackenzie said he couldn't share them without proper clearance, and that might only come after a lengthy Freedom of Information request. If he showed me the files, he might actually lose his job. And as he put it, he hadn't worked almost 30 years just to lose his pension over a slip-up like that. It was frustrating, but also strangely cathartic. Part of me hoped they'd just show me the files in a back room or something, but I guess that was just wishful thinking. Filing a FOIA request could take months, but to me, it was just another step on what had already been a long journey. I'd been searching for about 18 months by that point. A few more months wouldn't kill me. Even though I'd traveled all that way, I knew I wasn't going home completely empty-handed. Mackenzie and Constable Jacobs both promised to keep an eye out for my dad, and they said they'd call me if they heard or saw anything out there in the jaws of the bear, the marshlands where Susan Culver went missing. Before I left, Mackenzie asked what my plans were. I told him I was heading back to Wrigley, and I'd probably spend another night in my car before driving south in the morning. He wished me luck. I thanked him, and I walked outside to meet Winston near his truck. He'd picked up some sandwiches, and as we got on the road back to Wrigley, I gave him the rundown on what the Mounties told me. Winston said he'd been keeping me in his prayers, hoping I'd get my hands on those interview tapes sooner rather than later. I wouldn't say I was a religious person, not by any stretch, but sometimes, just sometimes, I think Winston's prayers found someone's ears. Because that night, as I tried to get some rest before my drive back south, I woke to someone knocking on the glass of my car window. When I looked outside and saw a distinctive red jacket, I realized who it was. Mackenzie, the Mountie from Deline. I sat up, opened my car door, and he asked if he could sit in the passenger seat. I said, "Sure." When he climbed in, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a cassette tape with a scribbled label. I couldn't read it right away. My interior light was off, so I wouldn't kill my battery, but I had a strong feeling what it was. Something he definitely shouldn't have been showing me. Mackenzie told me to turn on my car's tape player, so I did. When he slid the tape into the slot, my suspicions were confirmed. It was the tape of my dad's first interview, the one from before he was arrested. Since he wasn't considered a suspect during that first police interview, my dad was very forthcoming about certain things. As it turned out, he and Susie, as he called her, were out camping near the marshlands when Susie got up in the night to go pee outside the tent. After Susie left, my dad just rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but just seconds later, he heard Susan scream. My dad said he rushed to put on his boots, grabbed a flashlight, and ran out into the night to see what had scared Susan so badly, and that, according to him, is when he saw them. One of the interviewing Mounties asked my dad who they were. My dad responded by saying that if he told them, they'd think he was crazy. Then he said something about how if he'd known they were out there, he and Susie wouldn't have gone anywhere near the place, not in a million years. One of the Mounties then asked my dad where they took Susan Culver, and my dad said he didn't know, but wherever it was, he knew Susie was probably dead. She had to be, because there was no way she could survive what they were doing to her. Again, one of the Mounties asked who they were, and my dad exploded. He said, "How do you guys not know? You live out here," and other unhinged sounding things. Honestly, it's no wonder the Mounties assumed he murdered Susan Culver. He really did sound out of his goddamned mind. The Mounties asked a few more questions, but with each answer, my dad got more and more agitated. He didn't know why they didn't take him too. He hadn't seen anyone following them in the previous days, and he couldn't explain why there wasn't a drop of Susan's blood anywhere, despite his claims that she was violently attacked. After that, the Mounties announced they were terminating the interview, and the tape went dead. When I asked Mackenzie if he'd brought the second tape, he shook his head and told me it wasn't worth listening to. Based on what my dad had said during his first interview, the Mounties placed him under arrest on suspicion of Susan Culver's murder. Remember, my dad said he knew for certain she was dead. But then they put him through a second round of questioning. The reason it wasn't worth listening to was because my dad totally stonewalled the two Mounties. When he thought they might at least partially believe his story, my dad was very chatty. But once he realized he was a murder suspect, he did the smart thing and didn't say another word until he was released for lack of evidence. Mackenzie said that after he was released, my dad left town, but the search for Susan Culver continued for another 10 days. The search and rescue team found the campsite she'd shared with my dad, but they didn't find any trace of Susan. No clothes, no blood, no human remains. The search effort was eventually called off, and years later, her parents had her declared dead for legal purposes. She was taken off the missing persons register up there in Canada, but according to Mackenzie, there was something in the files that caught his attention. At one point, toward the end of the search, a dog from an RCMP search team ran off and was never seen again. The dog's disappearance sparked a whole new search, a kind of mini-search within the larger effort. Mounties searched high and low for the missing hound as well as Susan Culver, but neither was ever recovered. Mackenzie said the dog's disappearance was eventually chalked up to an operational hazard. It was mourned and replaced, but he thought there was a lot more to it than just a dog getting overexcited and drowning in a marsh. Remember, they never found Susan's body or the remains of that dog. In which case, where the hell did they go? Mackenzie finished by saying that, in his opinion, my dad and Susie Culver had come across some kind of illicit grow site, either marijuana or opium poppies, or maybe both. He was quick to add that he had absolutely no proof of that theory. But very little else explained some of the comments my dad made during that first interview. After I thanked Mackenzie for bringing me the tape, he left, and I was left to an uneasy sleep. It was weird hearing my dad that young, though he sounded a lot like me whenever I hear my own voice on tape. But that's obviously not what stuck with me that night. It was what he'd said during that first interview, along with how he'd said it. Driving back, I had these strange, mixed feelings of sadness and fear. I'd never felt so close to finding my dad, but at the same time, he'd never felt so distant. All his life, he'd probably been dealing with the aftermath of what happened up in the Northwest Territories. I can't speak for my mom, because I still don't know to what extent she knew all of this. But personally, I had no idea. That was almost 2 years ago, and at the time of writing, now, this is April of 2000, I'm still no closer to finding out the whole truth about my dad's disappearance. But these days, I have a much better idea where to look. Now that I can hold my own on a solo hiking trip, I think I'm just about ready to go looking for him. I'm planning on heading back up to Deline sometime in the summer, possibly in June, and I'll be sure to write up everything I find. I don't know how many of you will actually read this, but I don't care. This is good for my sanity, and when I find out anything else, this will be the first place I post to. I imagine I'll be posting another blog in a few months, and if I don't, I either found my dad or something else happened. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I remember the road as a black ribbon stretching into the vast, lonely void of the American West. It was just after 1:30 in the morning last November, and I was deep in the heart of nowhere, the kind of place where the stars hang so low. You feel like they might tear the sky. I'd been driving for hours, the hum of the engine a hypnotic drone against the silence. Fatigue had settled over me like a heavy blanket, making every mile an effort. My fuel gauge had been creeping toward empty for a while, a nagging whisper in the back of my mind. So when I finally saw the lonely neon sign of a two-pump gas station, it felt less like a pit stop and more like a hallucination. I turned off the highway. The tires crunched on the loose gravel of the lot, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the dead of night. My headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the familiar sight of a gas pump. Everything seemed as normal as could be. My eyes were locked on the pump display, a small digital screen that was my entire world at that moment. I was fixated on a single goal, getting exactly $30 worth of gas. No more, no less, a mindless ritual born of habit and exhaustion. I paid no attention to my surroundings. My mind was in a kind of waking sleep, a state of low-level awareness that shut out everything but the task at hand. It was only when I finished and walked over to the small kiosk to pay that a sliver of unease began to work its way in. It started with something simple, the complete absence of a person. The kiosk was brightly lit, the counter spotless, but there was no one manning it. At first, I just waited, thinking the attendant was either taking a quick bathroom break or had stepped into the back for a moment. But as the seconds stretched into a minute, I started to look around, really look, and that sliver of unease began to sharpen. The car at the pump in front of me was also stationary. Its driver was nowhere to be seen. They weren't in the car, and they weren't inside the convenience store either. A chill crept up my spine. My first thought was that both the driver and the gas station attendant must have been in the back of the store. Suddenly, I got this gut-wrenching feeling that I might have stumbled upon a robbery in progress. The thought of knocking on the glass or calling out for service suddenly seemed like the worst possible thing I could do. What if I was a witness to something terrifying? I remember turning to check out the car parked in front of me, thinking, if it's a Honda, then I'm getting out of here. The logic was simple, a desperate kind of superstition. Hondas, at least in my experience, are notoriously easy to steal, often a favorite among those with less than legal intentions. But it looked like a 2011 3 Series BMW. A BMW, on the other hand, is much harder to hotwire. That didn't completely rule out the possibility of a robbery, but it was enough to reassure me, at least for a moment. With a deep breath, I started knocking on the glass, asking if anyone was there. My knuckles rapped against the cold pane once, then twice, then a third time. Each knock echoed in the oppressive silence. A full minute passed, then another. It hit me that something highly unusual was happening. My next thought was to try the door to the convenience store. I was pretty sure it was supposed to be locked this late, but when I pushed on it, the door swung right open with a soft, groaning creak. A tiny bell jingled as I stepped inside, a stark contrast to the profound silence that met me. I walked up to the counter, calling out, "Hello?" The whole time. My voice felt small and fragile, swallowed up by the empty space. Thinking there might have been some kind of medical emergency, a heart attack, a fall, I jumped the counter and looked around the back of the store. There was a bathroom, a storage room, and a small office. All three were unlocked and empty. It was only then, standing in the heart of that empty building, that the surreal reality hit me. The entire gas station was completely deserted. I checked around the back just to be sure, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, but it was just as I expected. No one there. Once I was absolutely sure something seriously weird was going on, I pulled out my phone and got ready to dial 911. I still wasn't 100% sure what to do, so I called out hello again, but louder this time. When that got no response, I called the cops. At first, I could tell the dispatcher thought I was just some annoyed customer. But once I explained that there was literally no one to be found anywhere on the premises, she started to take my call more seriously. She asked where I was and if it looked like there had been a robbery. My voice, tight with tension, replied, "How the hell would I know?" She explained that if there had been a robbery recently, an employee might still be hiding somewhere, scared for their life. I felt a twinge of frustration. As I told her, I'd looked everywhere, or so I thought. Everywhere. That is, except for the dumpster around the side of the gas station. It was an afterthought, a stray idea that surfaced just as I was walking back from checking the highway for signs of life. I wanted to be able to tell the dispatcher, "I even checked the station's dumpster. There's nobody here, ma'am." I was exhausted. I just wanted to go home and crawl into bed. But when I opened the lid of the dumpster, I saw them. The sight hit me like a physical blow. I only caught a glimpse of what was inside before I dropped the lid and backed off, like the thing was radioactive. But a glimpse was more than enough. There were two bodies in there, twisted and bent, dark slick stains all over their clothes. One of them was almost certainly wearing a gas station uniform, the familiar logo a stark punch of color against the dark fabric. I remember saying something like, "Oh, Jesus. Oh my God," pacing away from the dumpster in total shock, with the dispatcher still in my ear. "Sir? Sir, tell me what's going on." "Sir." My mouth was dry. My heart was a frantic drum in my chest. I could barely get the words out. "They're in the dumpster. Jesus Christ. They're in the goddamn dumpster." The world had shrunk to a single, frantic point of sound. The dispatcher's voice, a thin thread of humanity cutting through my panicked breaths, and the pounding of my own heart. Everything else was a blur. The stench of decay, and what I could only assume was blood, hung in the cool night air, a sickening perfume that clung to my clothes and the back of my throat. My body reacted before my mind could process it. A sudden, violent wave of nausea surged through me, the kind that makes your stomach feel like a clenched fist. In a wild panic, I dropped my phone, grabbed my stomach, and ran toward the highway, away from the gas station and the grotesque secret it held. I just had to get away, to create distance from that horrific scene. As I ran, some long ago advice from a true crime podcast surfaced in my mind: preserve the integrity of a crime scene. The thought was absurdly clear, even in the midst of mental chaos. I was puking as I ran, but then another wave of nausea hit. I had to hold the bile in my mouth for a few seconds before finally letting it out near the highway. The retching was so violent it made my body shudder. After that, I just stood there, leaning against the cold metal of a guardrail, shaking uncontrollably. I pulled out my vape, a small comfort, and took a deep drag. The cool vapor did little to calm the fire in my lungs. I walked back and forth, puffing on it, trying desperately to ground myself in something, anything, other than the image seared into my mind. I felt like a man lost in a silent, desolate world, with the highway lights from distant cars the only sign of life. I was pacing like a caged animal when I saw the first cop car heading toward me, its red and blue lights a pulsing beacon of hope and dread. They pulled into the gas station lot, followed by another, then a third. Suddenly, the lot was bathed in a cacophony of flashing lights. The silence was broken by the purposeful sounds of police radios and hushed voices. An officer walked over to me, his face grim but professional, and asked a few questions. He was tall, with a steady gaze that felt both reassuring and intimidating. I explained everything, my words a jumbled mess of half-formed sentences, but he seemed to understand. After I gave my name and number, he told me I was free to leave. Those words, free to leave, felt like an immense, unexpected gift. I didn't want to stay a moment longer than I had to. I got back in my car. The interior suddenly felt like the safest place in the world. I drove away, the flashing lights shrinking in my rearview mirror until they were just pinpricks of color in the dark. The first chance I got, I looked the whole thing up online. It was a compulsion, a need to make sense of the senseless. I needed to know who those people were, what had happened to them, and why. The search results were a grim confirmation of my experience. I found a handful of stories about a member of the public, yours truly, finding 2 bodies at a gas station. But the articles were sparse on details. There was nothing that explained how or why the victims had been killed. No motive, no suspects, just a tragic, cold case. It was as if the crime had been committed by a ghost. The bodies simply left there to be found by the first person who stumbled upon them. The discovery lingered with me, a dark shadow that followed me everywhere. The world no longer felt safe, especially at night. I've been extra careful while driving ever since. I keep a very close eye on my fuel gauge and try to avoid any nocturnal pit stops. But there's a deeper caution now, a sixth sense that's been permanently switched on. If a gas station looks a little too quiet, a little too desolate, I'll avoid it altogether and just head to the next one, even if it means running on fumes. I can't shake the feeling that a quiet, empty place could be hiding another, more terrible secret, and I'll do anything to avoid being the one to find it. Without a doubt, the biggest scandal to ever hit my small Arkansas town happened one summer, when a 9th grade girl ended up in the hospital after being attacked while walking home from school. In our town, life moved at a different, almost sleepy pace. The biggest headlines were usually about the high school football team's latest win, or a bake sale at the church. So when this happened, it felt like the very ground beneath us had shifted. The attacker hadn't just beaten her. They had violated her to the point that she needed actual surgery to repair the damage. The brutality of it was unlike anything we had ever known. It wasn't just a physical assault. It was an assault on our sense of security, on the idea that our small town was a safe haven. The shock was palpable, a collective gasp that hung in the humid summer air. The doctor who performed the surgery, a man known for his calm and steady demeanor, broke down into tears during the press conference afterward. It was his job to share the good news, that the surgery had been successful and her life had been saved, and he still broke down. His choked-up words and tear-streaked face were a mirror of our own grief and disbelief. It was a stark reminder that this wasn't just a news story. It was a deeply human tragedy that had wounded us all. The next phase was trying to find the person who did it, but the victim's memory of the incident was hazy, fragmented by trauma. She couldn't give a detailed description of her attacker, only flashes of a figure, a general outline that could have been anyone. And so, the whole town descended into a total state of paranoia. Every stranger was eyed with suspicion. Every neighbor seemed to be hiding something. State police ran the investigation while local deputies went door to door, making visits to schools to appeal for information. It was an intense time. We'd never known anything like it. Around here, if someone gets a speeding ticket, it's all people gossip about for weeks, wondering where they were speeding to or who they were speeding from. To go from low crime to a brutal, violent attack, well, that was quite something. Everyone was praying the attacker would be found, and found fast, before anyone else got hurt. The town held its breath, waiting for a break in the case, for a name to be put to the face of the monster who walked among us. And then, out of the blue, a different kind of horror struck. A local pastor, a man everyone knew and respected, walked into his 17-year-old son's bedroom and shot him point-blank in the head. It was his wife, the boy's mother, who called the deputies on him. Her screams ripped through the quiet morning, so primal it felt like the whole town could hear her. She was still there, screaming bloody murder, when the deputies arrived to arrest him. The pastor didn't resist. He just stood there, a ghostly figure in the doorway of a shattered family, and let the deputies cuff him. He didn't say a word, just walked with them to their cruiser, his head held high, and off he went. The town reeled from this new shock, a fresh wound on top of the old one. We had gone from fear of a stranger to the incomprehensible reality of a father killing his own son. Down at the department, the pastor made a full confession. His voice was calm, almost detached. He told the deputies the whole chain of events, a chillingly precise recollection of how he ended his son's life. He and his boy had been talking when they came to a disagreement. The pastor calmly walked downstairs, took a pistol out of his gun safe, walked back upstairs, and shot his son. It was a cold, decalculated account that sent shivers down the spine of every officer in the room. He told them what gun he used, the caliber of the bullet, everything. Every detail was there, except one: the motive. The deputies asked him over and over what it was he and his boy had disagreed over, and why it was so bad the pastor felt he had to shoot him. They pleaded with him to explain, to give some context to a crime that seemed to defy all logic. But no matter how many times they asked, or how they phrased the question, the pastor wouldn't say what caused it. He simply repeated that he did it and asked to be taken to jail. He offered no remorse, no explanation, only the blunt, unyielding truth of what he had done, stripped of any reasons. This lack of motive became the center of a new and agonizing mystery. How could a man of God, a pillar of the community, commit such a heinous act against his own flesh and blood and not explain why? The media descended on the town, not just for the girl's attack, but now for this inexplicable murder. They painted a picture of a deranged man, a quiet town with a dark secret, and a story that seemed to get more twisted by the day. Officially, no one knows why the pastor killed his boy just over a week after that ninth grader ended up in the hospital. The file remains open on the motive, a blank space that haunts the records. The pastor was charged. With his full confession, the case was swiftly moved through the courts. But the legal proceedings didn't answer the question that truly mattered. In a small town where every secret is a currency, this one was a void. It's the reason the girl's attacker was never caught. The two crimes, once separate threads of tragedy, were assays. In fact, one horrifying tapestry. The town's official narrative spoke of two distinct, unsolved mysteries. But the unofficial one, the whispered, communal story, was simple. The son had been the attacker all along. The pastor, the father, had become the ultimate judge and jury, delivering a brand of justice that transcended legal bounds. The only thing that truly remains a mystery is how the pastor found out. Outside of a straight-up confession, it's hard to imagine how a father might come to learn something like that about his own flesh and blood. There's a lot of speculation around here. Some of it is good-natured, like the idea that a casual comment from a friend or teacher may have sparked his suspicion. But much of it is darker, painting a more insidious picture of eavesdropping or unearthing some hidden piece of evidence. Maybe he saw something in his son's eyes, a change in demeanor, a look that mirrored the same shadowy figure the town was hunting. It's a question that still hangs in the air, a final, unanswered why in a story full of them. Strangely, it doesn't seem to bother people that they'll never know how the pastor discovered his boy was the one who attacked that 9th-grade girl. However it happened, some folks around here are convinced the pastor did the right thing. They saw it not as a murder, but as a sacrifice, a twisted form of parental responsibility. The boy had brought shame and terror to the town, and his father, a man devoted to moral guidance, decided that the only path to redemption was through the ultimate, irreversible act. As shocking as it might seem, this sentiment is rooted in the deep, conservative values of our community. In a place where trust and honor are paramount, the idea of a father correcting the moral failing of his child, even in the most extreme way, is seen by some as a tragic but necessary act. In their eyes, the pastor protected the community from a predator, paying the ultimate price by sacrificing his own son. The tragedy of the girl's attack was so profound, the sense of violation so complete, that for many, this brutal act was seen as a harsh but justified resolution. The community closed ranks around this shared, unspoken belief, and the official story, with its blank spaces and unanswered questions, was quietly accepted. My name is Marco, and I'm writing to you from Estonia. We have a weird town called Kerdla where a lot of strange things happened in the 80s, and I think your viewers would be interested. I don't expect many of your American listeners to know where Estonia is, but that's fine. My geography of far-off places isn't great either. To put it simply, Estonia is in Russia's armpit, not exactly a great place to be. We are a reserved, independent, and nature-loving people, which really means we're emotionally distant loners who drink vodka and complain about the weather. If Estonia sounds weird, it's because it is. You have to be weird to survive when you're a tiny country caught between the giants of Europe and Asia. Things got even stranger when the communists took over. From the 1940s to 1991, we tried to resist the Russians, but there were just too many of them. They began ethnically cleansing our country, sending many to Siberia while importing native Russians to change our demographics. We went from 97% native Estonian to only 62% by 1989. Most people became second-class citizens in their own country, working in factories or serving in the army. The secret police were everywhere. You couldn't even go to the beach without permission. It was a time of hatred and paranoia. And the closer we got to independence, the more volatile people became, especially in Kerdla. Kerdla is the only town on the small island of Hiiumaa. Most of the people there are fishermen or work in tourism, but the third major industry is wrecking. The waters around Hiiumaa were a hotspot for naval combat during World War II, so there's a lot of money in salvaging sunken ships. This created a huge rift between the wreckers and the fishermen. The fishermen believed disturbing the dead sailors' resting places would bring bad luck, but the communist government encouraged people to dismiss such superstitions. Wrecking also paid much better, which only widened the gap. For years, there was a sense that something bad was going to happen, either from the hatred between the two groups, the bad luck the wreckers were bringing, or, worst of all, the curse of the Hiomao witches. I don't believe in witches, but many on the island do. A local legend says that hundreds of years ago, a fisherman insulted a coven of witches, who then cursed his family with misfortune for generations. Since many of Kurdla's fishing families were descended from this line, the curse was often blamed for the loss of fishing vessels. All this tension was like an earthquake building up. It all came to a head during one week in September 1989. There was one big event, then a series of smaller psychic aftershocks. The first incident, the earthquake, if you will, took place when a girl named Dasha Brova blew up a Russian cafe. She flooded the kitchens with gas, then ignited it. The explosion happened toward the end of the service on a Saturday evening. The restaurant was packed, and the kitchen staff were in the dining area, relaxing with some hard-earned vodka after work. By the time anyone smelled the gas, it was too late. The blast tore through the small building, a deafening roar, followed by the sickening crunch of collapsing timbers and the tinkle of 1,000 shards of glass. A plume of black smoke billowed into the evening sky, a macabre signal visible from all corners of the small town. When all was said and done, 14 people were hospitalized, some with life-threatening injuries, and 5 more died. The authorities were quick to blame anti-Russian sentiment and were ready to use it as an excuse to arrest dissident Estonians suspected of supporting the independence movement. They saw an opportunity to crack down, to make an example of those who yearned for freedom. But when it was discovered that the perpetrator was none other than a 16-year-old Russian cocktail waitress, the whole town was stunned. Dasha had no history of violent or destructive behavior. By all accounts, she was quiet, fairly popular, and did well in school. She was not a political agitator, not a revolutionary, just a girl. The question hung in the air like the lingering scent of smoke and burnt debris. What caused a well-behaved, unassuming schoolgirl to suddenly want to blow herself up and take as many people as possible with her? Police were still trying to make sense of it all when, just 2 days later, a Russian fishing boat worker swerved his car into a line of schoolchildren waiting for the morning bus. The sun had barely risen, casting long, pale shadows across the street. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, a serene morning shattered by the horrific screech of tires. He was blackout drunk. It was only 7:30 in the morning. Witnesses said it looked like he deliberately swerved into the kids after flooring the accelerator. This wasn't an accident. It was an act of pure, unadulterated malice. The man must have knocked himself out after slamming into a wall, because he stayed in his driver's seat until the police showed up to drag him out. But when they did, he was laughing. Everyone saw it. The police, the medics, all the members of the public running around trying to save the kids' lives. They saw it clear as day. When the drunk realized what he had done, he started laughing so hard you'd think he was about to piss himself. As they dragged him to the police car, he started shouting, "Odin, dva, tri, chitayer, Russian for 1, 2, 3, 4. He wasn't just laughing. He was counting the number of children he'd hit who weren't moving or crying or screaming. He was counting the dead. It was a moment of profound evil, an act so depraved it defied all understanding. The laughter, the counting, it was a performance for the world to see, a celebration of death that left an entire town speechless. As you can imagine, the residents of Kurdla were in shock. Within just 3 days, there had been the restaurant explosion, then 4 dead school children, with many more injured. The local medical clinic was completely full. So many of the kids had to be taken to the mainland for proper treatment. The small town was overwhelmed. It was so shocking that it almost felt like a war had started. It felt as if we were under attack from some unknowable force from the outside. People huddled in their homes, a collective sense of dread hanging over them like a thick fog. They looked at their neighbors, at their own children, and wondered what fresh horror the morning would bring. But after the incident with the kids, people told themselves, in typical Estonian fashion, well, now things can't get any worse, so it's all downhill from here. But then things did get worse. There was a big funeral and vigil held for the school children who lost their lives that morning when the drunk decided to smash into them. The entire town came together in a grim procession, a sea of black coats and somber faces. The air was heavy with unspoken grief, a silent testament to the lives so senselessly extinguished. Everyone in Kardla was in attendance, at least almost everyone, with nearly the whole town out in the streets and walking to the cemetery together. It became easy to notice who wasn't there. As people started to realize that one particular family was missing, their curiosity turned to concern. A small group went to check on the absent family, only to make a truly terrible discovery. A boy of just 11 had convinced his little sister, who was about 7, to join him in murdering their mother and father. They woke up early. While their parents were still in bed, they crept downstairs, grabbed a pair of very sharp kitchen knives, and then returned upstairs to their parents' bedroom. Together, they cut both their parents' throats as they slept. The cold, logical precision of the act was the most chilling part. But people don't just die immediately from having their throats cut, especially if the major blood vessels aren't hit. Instead of bleeding out instantly, the kids' parents tried frantically to stop the bleeding and to fight off their own children. It was hopeless. The mother's body was found in the bathroom. The father made it downstairs, collapsing in the kitchen as he tried to reach the phone to call 03, the Soviet emergency number for medical help. The scene was a grotesque tableau of misplaced trust and unimaginable malice. This marked the third incident of multiple murders within just a week. The psychic aftershocks were growing in intensity. Instead of telling each other, "Cheer up, things can't get any worse," people began to wonder what the next horror would be. The mood shifted from shock and sadness to near panic. People wouldn't let their kids go to school. They refused to go to work or do anything remotely dangerous. It was as if everyone was convinced there was some kind of curse on the town. Of course, there wasn't, but that didn't matter. If people truly believe something, they can act in ways you'd never expect. The wreckers started to throw back some of the most valuable things they'd salvaged from the sunken ships. They tossed medals, trinkets, all sorts of trophies back into Kardla harbor at night, hoping to appease the angry spirits of dead sailors. Some fishermen, meanwhile, left offerings in the woods for the witches of Hiiumaa, certain that they were behind the town's horrors. It was as if the entire town had fallen into a sudden, all-consuming collective madness, lashing out and acting in the strangest ways. They kept waiting for the next terrible thing to happen. But mercifully, the psychic storm hovering over Kardla finally lifted. I don't use that term literally, but to me, it's the only way to describe what happened that week in 1989. Kardla had gone years without so much as a common assault. And then, in the span of just 7 days, a dozen people lost their lives in a series of senseless, violent acts. It's almost enough to make a person believe in restless spirits or ancient curses. But if you ask me, what's to blame is something buried deep in our programming as biological machines, lines of code we've been running since the days we lived in caves. When shadows cast monsters on the walls during long, uncertain nights. The air in Kardla, Estonia, on that bleak morning in 1989 was not just cold with the autumn chill. It was heavy with a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight. The entire town, a small, close-knit community on the island of Hiiumaa, had turned out for the funeral procession. The day before, a drunk driver had barreled through a group of school children, extinguishing their bright, nascent lives in an instant. Now, a silent, somber sea of black coats and furrowed faces moved through the streets. It was a slow-motion river of sorrow making its way to the cemetery. Every single person who called Kurdla home was there, or so it seemed. The shared tragedy was so immense, so all-encompassing, that the procession felt like a grim, involuntary census. In this tally of grief, a few people began to notice who wasn't there. As the crowd shuffled along, united in mourning, the absence of one particular family started to feel like a gaping hole. They were a quiet family, but well known, and missing such a significant community event was jarring. As more people noticed, a quiet, creeping concern spread, replacing collective grief with an unsettling anxiety. What could possibly keep them away? A small group of family friends, unable to shake their unease, broke away from the procession and made their way to the family's modest, gray house on the edge of town. They knocked and called out, but received no answer. The silence inside was as chilling as the air outside. Finally, a neighbor with a spare key opened the door for them. What they found inside was not just terrible. It was a violation of the natural order. An 11-year-old boy, just a child himself, had convinced his 7-year-old sister to join him in a meticulously planned matricide and patricide. The chilling precision of the act was the most unsettling part. Early that morning, while their parents were still asleep, the two children had crept downstairs, retrieved a pair of razor-sharp kitchen knives, and returned to their parents' bedroom, with a cold, terrifying logic no child should possess. They cut both their parents' throats as they slept. But the act was not as quick or clean as they had planned. The human body is a surprisingly resilient machine, and simply cutting the throat does not always result in instantaneous death, especially if the major arteries aren't severed. The children's parents, instead of being immediately incapacitated, woke up to a nightmare. They thrashed and fought, bleeding profusely as they tried desperately to fend off their own children and staunch the flow of blood. Their struggle was in vain. The mother's lifeless body was found in the bathroom, where she had tried to seek refuge. The father's was in the kitchen, a grotesque, final tableau. He had collapsed and died just inches from the telephone. His last desperate act, an attempt to call for help on the Soviet emergency number 03. The scene was a macabre painting of misplaced parental trust and unfathomable childish malice. This was not an isolated tragedy. The collective shock of the town was already at its breaking point. Just a week prior, a dozen people had been killed in a series of senselessly violent acts. Now, this horrifying discovery marked the third incident of multiple murders in just 7 days. The psychic aftershocks were growing in intensity. Fear was becoming more and more pronounced with each new tragedy. The town had been stoic in the face of the first deaths, saddened but resilient. Now, that resilience was gone, replaced by a terror seeping into every corner of daily life. A simple, reassuring thought, "Cheer up, things can't get any worse," became a new question. What will the next thing be? Full-on panic had begun to descend, a silent, creeping contagion of fear. As the terrible news spread from the funeral procession to every home, a silent, pervasive panic began to descend upon Kurdla. It wasn't chaos, filled with screaming and running. Instead, it was a deep, bone-chilling dread that paralyzed the town. People stopped going to work. Shops stayed shuttered. The fishermen's boats were tied to the docks, their nets left empty. Parents, once trusting of their small town's safety, now refused to let their children out of the house, much less attend school. The community was convinced that a curse had befallen them. a malevolent force unleashed upon their peaceful existence. This belief, however irrational, didn't matter if people truly, deeply believe something. Their actions become a testament to that faith, no matter how bizarre or desperate. The collective fear had become a contagion, a shared delusion that took on a terrifying life of its own. In the face of this invisible enemy, the townsfolk turned to old superstitions and ancient rituals. The wreckers, men who made their living salvaging valuables from sunken ships off the Hiiumaa coast, were among the first to act. They were hard, practical men, but the recent tragedies had broken their stoicism. They began throwing their most prized spoils back into the Kordla harbor, medals, trinkets, coins, and treasures they had guarded for years. In the dead of night, they walked to the water's edge, faces grim, and tossed their trophies into the darkness, watching them sink to the bottom. Their hope, a desperate prayer born of fear, was that this act would appease the angry spirits of the dead sailors whose graves they had plundered. Meanwhile, a different kind of ritual was taking place in the thick, whispering woods of Hiiumaa. The fishermen, who spent their lives between sea and sky, held an equally firm belief. To them, the island's folklore wasn't just a story, it was alive. They were convinced that the horrifying events were the work of the witches of Hiiumaa, ancient spirits who dwelled in the deep forests. The fishermen left offerings of fresh fish, bread, and handmade trinkets at the bases of gnarled, old trees, hoping to placate the witches and earn their mercy. It was a stark visual of the community's splintered desperation, some facing the sea, others turning to the forest, all of them acting on an impulse to reverse a madness they could not comprehend. The once rational, pragmatic people of Kordla had all fallen victim to a sudden, all-consuming collective madness. Suspicion and fear made them lash out at one another and act in ways that defied logic. They were no longer a community united by shared life, but a collection of individuals gripped by terror. Each person waited, watched, and listened for the next terrible thing to happen. Their nerves stretched to the breaking point. Their minds conjured monsters in every shadow. Kordla had gone from a state of shock to full-on societal breakdown, a town held hostage by its own fear. Then, as abruptly as the storm had begun, it abated. The town held its breath, waiting for the next tragedy, but none came. The psychic storm that had hovered over Kordla for 7 terrifying days had finally passed. The days that followed were filled with a hesitant, almost cautious return to normalcy. The fishermen went back out to sea. The wreckers returned to their trade. The children, still watched with anxious eyes, were allowed to play in the streets again. The quiet, peaceful rhythm of life on Hiiumaa was slowly reasserting itself. Yet the memory of that week lingered like a phantom ache. Kordla had been a town untouched by such horror for years. It was a place where neighbor trusted neighbor, where the most pressing issue was often the weather or the day's catch. And yet, in the space of just 1 week, a dozen people lost their lives in a series of senselessly violent acts. A drunk driver, a murder-suicide, and then the unthinkable. A pair of children turning on their own parents. It was a chain of events so improbable and so horrifying that it was almost enough to make a person believe in restless spirits or ancient Wiccan curses. But if you were to ask the old-timers who lived through it, they might offer a different, more chilling explanation. They would tell you it wasn't a curse from the sea or the woods that had descended upon them, but something far more primal. The sudden, intense wave of violence and madness, they would say, was a manifestation of something deep within humanity's programming. It was a latent line of code that had been running since the days our ancestors lived in caves, when the world was a constant state of uncertainty and fear. In those long, dark nights, the shadows on the walls were not just shapes, they were monsters. When a community is pushed to its absolute breaking point, when the illusion of safety is shattered, that ancient primal programming can reassert itself. It's a collective fight or flight response, a regression to a more primitive state of being, where logic gives way to superstition and fear becomes a contagion. The events of that week in 1989 were a powerful, tragic reminder that the monsters we fear most are not in the shadows, but instead sleeping within us, waiting for the right moment to awaken. I grew up in the quiet, expansive heartland of Nebraska. Back in my senior year of high school, I spent my weekends working second shift at a rural gas station from 2 o'clock p.m. to around 9 o'clock p.m. on Saturdays and Sundays. I'd fill my hours with the predictable rhythm of small-town life. One early summer afternoon, I set off for work under a sky that was nothing but clear blue, just a few wispy clouds drifting by. It was the kind of day that makes you feel like the whole world is right where it's supposed to be. Call me sentimental, but I don't think there's anything quite like driving through Nebraska. You hit the highway outside some small town, and suddenly, the world stretches out in front of you as far as the eye can see. The skyline is almost unbroken, interrupted only by the graceful silhouette of a windmill, a weathered barn, or a small patch of trees. On a sunny day, it really is as pretty as a picture. Up until that afternoon, May had brought nothing but sunshine and gentle showers. But as I drove along the highway, something felt different. My eyes were drawn to the distance, where storm clouds, dark and menacing, were rolling in. The general rule is that most storm clouds look much scarier than they actually are, especially when you see that big wall of angry, bruised-looking clouds facing you down like something straight out of a biblical epic. Most of the time, you just get a little rain, a little wind, nothing much else to worry about. But this time, something in my gut told me this was going to be bad. By the time I got to the gas station, local radio stations were already sounding the storm warnings. My coworker and I usually did a quick handover, but with those warnings blaring, we suddenly had a lot more work on our hands. The casual rhythm of our day was instantly replaced by a frantic, focused energy. We hustled to secure all of our outdoor fixtures or drag them inside, from the overflowing trash cans to the promotional signs. We locked all the windows, checked the pumps, and shut off the fuel completely. My coworker went to fuel up the generator, just in case we lost power. Meanwhile, I gathered flashlights and batteries, since candles were obviously out of the question in a gas station. Flashlights were a top priority. We already had our designated shelter lined up, the station's office, so after making sure the first aid kit was fully stocked, we kept the radio tuned and our ears open for weather alerts, and we figured people would stay home, and we were in for a turbulent but probably lonely shift. We were wrong. One by one, 3 cars pulled up to the station over the course of about an hour. 2 were driven by single people, and the other contained a mom and her 2 young daughters. Wherever they'd been, their path home led directly through the heart of the storm. Instead of risking their lives on the highway, they came to us and begged for shelter here. We couldn't say no. We weren't exactly equipped to shelter that many people, especially not overnight, but there was just no turning them away. The moral weight of the situation was immense. It was a choice between squeezing into a small, cramped office or facing the violent, unpredictable fury building outside. We let everyone help themselves to drinks and snacks if they were hungry. Mostly, we just wanted to calm their nerves as the storm outside grew worse and worse. The air in the station grew thick with an almost tangible anxiety. The single man, a weathered trucker, sat quietly nursing a coffee, his eyes fixed on the horizon through the large plate glass windows. The younger woman, a college student, by the looks of her, nervously fiddled with her phone, trying in vain to get a signal that was long gone. But the strongest tension radiated from the young mom. Her maternal instincts were on high alert. Her two little girls, one no older than 5, the other maybe 3, clung to her legs, their small faces a mixture of confusion and fear. She tried to distract them, pointing out funny-shaped clouds and inventing stories. Her voice a calm anchor in a sea of unspoken dread. And boy, did it get worse. The wind began to howl, a low, guttural moan that grew into a frantic shriek. We all stayed relatively calm, a silent agreement to project a sense of normalcy, until we heard the unmistakable sound of the tornado sirens. It was a sound and I'm pretty sure all the adults there had heard before. It's a sound that doesn't just fill the air, it seeps into your bones. But it scared the hell out of the young mother's 2 daughters. They had never experienced anything like it, a high-pitched, wailing warning that promised imminent danger. The girls started crying and screaming, begging their mom to take them home, to take them away from this terrifying noise. The mother's face crumpled with helplessness, a reflection of every parent who's ever wanted to protect their child from a world they can't control. Then, a piece of something, we never found out what, slammed into one of the cars outside. The sound was a sickening crunch, followed by the shriek of a car alarm. That was the storm's destructive power made real. And it sent the little girls into even deeper panic. They just didn't understand what was happening. All they saw was their safe, familiar world being torn apart. A few more things fell off our roof, and that was enough. We knew we had to take shelter in the station's office. There was just enough room to fit everyone. 6 people crammed into a small, windowless space meant for 1 or 2. It was a tight, uncomfortable fit. But as the door shut behind us, the sound of the sirens and the howling wind grew muffled. The girls finally began to calm down. The physical closeness and the small, secure space offered a fragile sense of protection, a brief respite from the chaos. We were all huddled in the office, the flimsy walls and a solid door our only barrier against the maelstrom. The air was thick with the scent of coffee, stale office paper, and the collective anxiety of strangers thrown together by catastrophe. The muffled howl of the wind outside was a constant, terrifying hum, a beast circling our small sanctuary. The fragile peace we'd found shattered in an instant when something flew across the parking lot and smashed through the big, plate glass window of the store. It didn't just break, it exploded. The sound was like a bomb going off, a concussive blast that rattled the very foundation of our makeshift shelter. It ripped through the relative quiet of the office and made the space feel suddenly, terrifyingly vulnerable. It scared the hell out of me and my co-worker. By that point, we were kind of expecting something to give, but the 2 little girls nearly lost their minds. Their small bodies shook with fresh, uncontrollable sobs. They must have thought the whole building was coming down. And so did one of the single drivers. As the girl started shrieking, she had a full-blown panic attack. Her eyes, wide with terror that seemed to go beyond the storm, darted around the room. She was a young woman, but in that moment, she looked 1,000 years old. She scrambled to her feet and tried to run back to her car, fixated on the flimsy, shattered shell outside. It was a primal, fight-or-flight response, a desperate need to escape the perceived trap of the gas station. Once we realized what she was trying to do, my coworker lunged at her, shouting that going outside meant absolute death. But she wouldn't listen. Her fear had completely overtaken her rational mind. She fought my coworker, screaming and flailing in a desperate, frantic struggle. It took both me and the other single driver to subdue her, holding her down against the floor. The little girls were screeching so hard they could barely breathe, watching the chaos unfold. The sight of a grown-up losing control, caught in a struggle as violent as the storm itself, was more terrifying to them than the wind and the sirens. The woman struggled a little more, her body a coiled spring of panic, and then, as we held her, she just broke. She burst into tears. The fight drained out of her as if a switch had been flipped. She lay there, sobbing, apologizing over and over. We rode out the storm together for the next few hours. The storm continued its violent symphony outside, but a different kind of calm settled over the room. I remember the thing that really united us, keeping those two little girls from screaming themselves unconscious. We became a collective, a team with a single mission. I worked hard to keep them calm, reassuring them that we were all going to be just fine, telling silly stories, pointing out the strange shapes the shadows made in the flickering light of our flashlights. But sometimes, when I think about it, I realize we were all just trying to reassure ourselves, too. Talking to those little girls was a kind of projection, a way to give our own terrified selves a semblance of hope and control. Eventually, the sounds of the wind died down, replaced by a strange, unsettling silence. After about an hour, it looked safe enough for everyone to make a move. We unlatched the office door and cautiously stepped out, a group of shell-shocked survivors. The store was absolutely trashed. So much debris had blown in that it was impossible to tell what exactly had smashed the window and made that explosive sound. It was like a scene from a disaster movie, only this was our reality. Glass, snacks, magazines, and debris were everywhere, a chaotic tapestry of destruction. We had to tread carefully, our steps crunching on a carpet of shards. The folks who had sought shelter with us stood and looked out at their cars. Their faces were a mix of relief and exhaustion. The trucker's rig was miraculously untouched, but the college student's car was dented, and the young mom's car had a deep gouge where the flying debris hit it. Still, all the vehicles were functional, and, most importantly, everyone was safe. They thanked us before getting into their cars. Their words held a deeper gratitude than any customer transaction could ever contain. The young mom, in particular, hugged both me and my coworker, her eyes welling up as she thanked the other two drivers for helping keep her daughters calm when she herself was almost losing her mind. She gave us all a final, heartfelt glance, a silent promise to never forget the kindness of strangers in the middle of a storm. After that, everyone, except me and my coworker, went their separate ways. They drove off into the darkness, leaving us standing in the wrecked store. The silence was profound, broken only by the hum of emergency lights and the occasional drip of water from a leak in the ceiling. We stood there for a long time, looking at the mess, at the shattered window, and at each other. There were no words to describe what we had just gone through. We were just two kids who worked at a gas station, and for a few hours, we had been first responders, counselors, and protectors. That night, we were more than just co-workers. We were a testament to the power of human resilience in the face of nature's fury. The memory of that night, of the terror and the unity, is something I'll carry with me forever.